In the state capitol building in Frankfort, Kentucky, stand two statues. They depict two of the state's most prominent sons, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. Lincoln stands in the center of the rotunda, Jefferson Davis at the center of controversy.
The thing that has really done Jefferson Davis in is the attitude that people have towards the Confederate flag. Because his reputation is inextricably bound up with all that people think about when they see that image. And so there is no pre-Confederacy Davis. It's almost as if he were, in the average American's mind, born in 1861 out of nowhere. And the idea that there was a Davis before and a Davis after simply does not exist.
By 1861, the year the Union split and led to Civil War, Jefferson Davis had already lived over half a century. Those 53 years were not spent, though, as a radical or rebel, fire eaters they were called. Instead, Jefferson Davis lived as a patriot of the United States of America and as a firm advocate of the Union.
Even during the war, Davis often referred to his devotion to what he called the old Union at that point. He said that he had been educated by the Union, which he was, of course, at West Point, that he had served the Union both as a military man and as a young Army officer and in the Mexican War, that he had served the Union in Washington as a congressman, as a senator, a secretary of war. He always described himself as a national Democrat, not a Southern Democrat. And I think he always held a devotion for the Union. Even the sight of the United States flag during the war often affected him emotionally, because that was the flag to which he had sworn allegiance so many years earlier when he was at West Point. And I think he found the ties very difficult to break.
Jefferson Davis went from being the South's greatest statesman in the Union to the appointed leader of the Confederate States of America. His uncompromising principles and unwavering devotion to the cause led the Confederacy through its formation and 4 long and painful years of war. With the same tenacity he fought to keep the United States together, Davis struggled to keep the Confederate States alive, even in the face of inevitable defeat. The war's end found Jefferson Davis imprisoned, charged with treason against the United States. His release after 2 years was embraced by the people of the South, but Reconstruction was as hard on him personally as it was on the former Confederate States. In the face of all that was lost, Jefferson Davis would go on. He would live another quarter century as president of an extinct nation. A man without a country, and an exile on his native ground. Jefferson Davis lived an epic life, filled with great accomplishment and tremendous loss. But his long life of 81 years started very simply in 1808. Born the last of 10 to a struggling family on the Kentucky frontier.
Jefferson Davis probably had no recollection whatever of his childhood in Kentucky. He was born into an average, middle-class by Western terms family. His father was a planter, sometime innkeeper. Built a dog-trot cabin, that is, 2 cabins side by side with an open breezeway between them.
In the early 1790s, Jefferson Davis's parents, Samuel and Jane Cook Davis, left the land in Georgia that Samuel earned for service in the Revolutionary War. They followed the shifting American frontier to Kentucky.
Samuel Davis, like so many people of his time and place out on this western frontier in the early 1800s, was hoping to improve his own financial station, hoping to improve the situation of his family at large. He had done all right in western Kentucky, but he'd failed to prosper. There was newer land as a result of the Louisiana Purchase, and cheap land available south in Louisiana first. But once he moved to the Bayou Teche country, Samuel quickly found out that it didn't suit him or his family. The climate seemed unhealthy to them. It was a raw and unsettled country. It was an economy that was going to be based on sugar cultivation, about which Samuel Davis knew nothing whatever.
So Samuel Davis decided to move the family again, this time to Mississippi, to the booming cotton economy in the southwestern part of the state. The family settled in Wilkinson County, outside the small town of Woodville.
You look at his moves from Georgia to Kentucky to Mississippi, and the years between the early 1790s and the end of the first decade of the 19th century, this was not an easy task to move a family these kinds of distances at that time. He was obviously ambitious for his family.
With the family finally settled, Samuel Davis cleared the land, started his crops, and began building a modest home. He owned nearly 400 acres of southwestern Mississippi frontier, and by 1810 he completed his house, calling it Poplar Grove. They later changed the name to Rosemont for his wife Jane Cook Davis's love and cultivation of her favorite flower. In the last year of his life, Jefferson Davis wrote of Rosemont, "There my memories begin."
Woodville, Mississippi, and Rosemont, where young Jefferson Davis traced his first memories, where he went through the boyhood that all boys most remember, was perhaps an idyllic place. It was a picture of the early 19th century rural frontier in which a boy could ride and hunt and shoot. He had enormous freedom when not under parental guidance. It was a place where he could grow and expand. He could build a host of experiences that are the kinds that fill the imaginations of boys of his time. Romping with friends, playing on the river, hunting, riding horseback, everything that the young boys of his time and his class most dreamed of. It's not surprising that his earliest recollections would trace to Woodville and to Rosemont, because that's where he was a boy. That was his first and his last chance to be a boy.
He was the adored youngest child, particularly close to the two sisters who were closest to him in age, who had lived, of course, at the family home when he was growing up. He really didn't know his older brothers that well, except for Joseph, who took him in hand in the 1820s. He particularly liked his sister Lucinda Stamps, who lived at the family homestead and continued to live there her whole life.
But Rosemont never grew into the expansive plantation that Samuel Davis dreamed of.
They were not the landed wealthy. They were not the aristocrats that, say, the first families of Virginia were, 1,000 miles to the east. Yet they were there in a time and place where they could become among the first families of Mississippi, setting up a new aristocracy and a new frontier.
And as a young boy, Jefferson Davis witnessed firsthand the most integral part of that aristocracy: slavery.
He was born in a slave society. He was raised in a slave society. His father owned slaves, never very many, but his father owned slaves. The one tangible thing he inherited from his father was a slave. Really, it's the only tangible thing he inherited from his father was this one slave, James Pemberton.
The one thing, though, that Samuel Davis valued more than slaves, more than the land, was education. But frontier Mississippi offered few opportunities for his bright, beloved Jefferson. So Samuel sent his 8-year-old son on a 700-mile journey north to central Kentucky. Jefferson Davis would call St. Thomas College home for the next 2 years.
Just the journey there alone stayed in Davis's mind for the rest of his life. I think perhaps the first opening of his eyes to the fact that there was a world beyond the limits of his father's plantation.
Not only was young Jefferson leaving his family and his home, He was entering a Catholic institution and, by his own recollection, was the only non-Catholic boy there.
Samuel Davis, a Baptist, to send his son from Mississippi to Kentucky to a Roman Catholic school, and Jefferson Davis went. We're talking 8 years old. He was a child. It's really unusual.
During those 2 years, Samuel sent letters to his son reminding him of the importance of education. In one letter he wrote, "Use every possible means to acquire useful knowledge, as knowledge is power, the want of which has brought mischief and misery on your father in old age." When suitable academies opened in Mississippi, Jefferson Davis returned home, continuing his education at both Jefferson College and Wilkinson Academy. Mathematical prowess would always elude him. It was the humanities, especially classical languages and history, in which Davis excelled. But fortunately for young Davis, lessons were not just reserved for the classroom.
When he was attending the academy there in Woodville, he came home one day very distressed that the schoolmaster had disciplined him and he didn't want to go to school anymore. And so Samuel said, "Okay, you can, if you don't want to go to school, you can do the work of a man." And Samuel put him out to work alongside the slaves and work in the fields. And Jefferson Davis found out very quickly that this was not exactly how he wanted to spend his life, and so he went back to school.
And by the early 1820s, the most prominent university west of the Appalachians was Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky.
At Transylvania University, young Jefferson Davis's intellect flourished as he embraced the institution's focus on the humanities.
Jefferson Davis's years at Transylvania University were perhaps the happiest of his young, and I mean young, manhood. It was opening to his intellect to encounter the distinguished staff at this Western university.
He made friends quickly. He became a popular student there at Transylvania, and he gave an oration at the end of his junior year, and the local newspaper there in Lexington praised it and said that Jefferson Davis was an individual who would make a name for himself in the world.
While young Jefferson was expanding his worldview beyond the scope of plantation life, back home in Woodville, his father struggled to keep him in school.
He did fall on hard financial times, and he was saved by his oldest son, Joseph, who became Jefferson's surrogate father. Joseph Davis had become an attorney in Natchez. He'd become a very prominent man, and he'd begun buying up a lot of land as well. He was beginning to accumulate the wealth that would make him one of the richest men in the state of Mississippi. And he did come in and help out his father at the very end of his father's life. In fact, Samuel died at Joseph Davis's plantation up in Warren County, Mississippi, south of Vicksburg.
I cannot describe the anguish I felt at the news of the death of my father. He was a parent ever dear to me, but rendered more so, if possible, by the disastrous storms that attended the winter of his old age. When I saw him last, he told me we would probably never see each other again, but I still hope to meet him once more. But heaven has refused my wish.
Jefferson Davis, August 2nd, 1824. Joseph Davis immediately took over as father figure for his brother Jefferson, and his first decision was that Jefferson would not graduate from Transylvania University. Through a political connection with then Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, Joseph secured an appointment for Jefferson at the United States Military Academy at West Point.
Well, think about Jefferson Davis as a young man of 16 who's been at Transylvania a year and a half and has sort of become, they wouldn't have used a term like big man on campus, but he's a notable person, and he's up in the senior class now, and he's a person to be reckoned with, and all of a sudden He'd go to West Point, which is a long way away, way up in New York State. He'd never been so far away, and he'd have to be a freshman. You'd have to go back to knowing nobody, and being a very long way from home. Jefferson Davis was obviously not enthusiastic about going, but Joseph Davis wanted him to go. Joseph Davis insisted he go, and Jefferson Davis, like many other teenagers before and since, when parental authority, though Joseph is surrogate parental authority, say go, you go.
Jefferson Davis and the U.S. Military Academy were not a perfect fit from the start. The idea of going into an academic environment in which discipline and obedience, unquestioning obedience, were the rule of the day did not necessarily come naturally to him.
But Jefferson Davis wasn't your model student. Indeed, Sylvanus Thayer, who is seen as the real father of West Point, used to refer to Jefferson Davis as his unnatural child, because Jefferson Davis was a problem, a disciplinary problem at West Point.
While at West Point, Davis met fellow cadets Robert E. Lee, Albert Sidney Johnston, and Leonidas Polk, men who would all feature prominently in the war between the states.
Throughout the rest of his life, he would always look back on those friendships formed at West Point as the best of his life.
Benny Haven's Tavern was a tavern near the campus at West Point. It was off limits for students to go there, but students did go there. They would go there and they would smoke and they would eat and they would drink.
Jefferson Davis seems to have been a fun-loving, enthusiastic young college student, just like all college students in all eras. He probably had all the makings of a good frat boy by later definitions.
Edgar Allan Poe, a classmate of Jefferson Davis's, was miserable at West Point and often sought comfort at Benny Haven's. Davis commiserated, stealing away along that well-worn path to the tavern to join Poe for late-night merriment.
Jefferson Davis got caught down there. He was caught by one of the cadre, that is, officers in the West Point were down. They caught Davis with some of his fellow students, and Davis was put on a formal trial. He was court-martialed.
As was the custom at West Point, the cadets conducted their own defense. Davis conducted his own.
The boys were ingenious, though. They could not prove that Jefferson Davis had taken a drink at Benny Haven's Tavern, because what the boys would do when they would get ready to drink, they would all face the wall. They could honestly say, I did not see somebody taking a drink, because they were facing the wall, so they couldn't see anybody taking a drink.
He made the technical argument that the rules of the military academy forbid cadets from drinking ardent spirits. And what he drank, he claimed, was beer. And therefore, beer wasn't an ardent spirit, and therefore he did not get dismissed from West Point. But it was actions like this that really drove Sylvanus Thayer crazy.
In previous years, parties at West Point had gone completely out of control. So, beginning in 1826, Superintendent Thayer decided to ban the tradition of Christmas eggnog.
But Jefferson Davis was amongst a group of cadets who said, we're going to have eggnog no matter what. And they obtained the spirits necessary, provided allegedly by the same Benny Haven's. And the eggnog was made on Christmas Eve, and people began to drink it.
After midnight Christmas morning, Jefferson Davis's North Barracks became Eggnog Central. And Thayer, no fool, sent out officers looking for drunk cadets.
Jefferson Davis learned they were coming, and he ran into one of the rooms and called out, put away the grog, boys. Of course, one of the officers was standing in the room, and so he was a day late and $1 short. But that may have saved his career at West Point, because he was ordered to go back to his room by this officer, and he went back to his room.
The party got completely out of hand, and the chief participants in it were expelled from West Point. Jefferson Davis did not receive demerits for that at all.
There were so many boys involved in this eggnog riot. When the investigation was held, the superintendent realized if he threw out everybody connected with the riot, he would have throw out such a large percentage of the school that the school could be in trouble. And so he was looking for ways to keep people in.
Despite demerits, pranks, and a relatively low class standing, Jefferson Davis did graduate in 1828. He would always look back on West Point with fondness and regarded the institution with great respect. Years later, when Davis was Secretary of War, there was an opportunity to create a military academy exclusively for Southerners. He opposed it. In a letter written in April of 1854, he voiced his dissent.
Experience has shown that the bringing together of young men from all parts of the country at a period of life when they imbibe lasting impressions creates friendships among Northern, Southern, Eastern, and Western youths.
After a visit home to Mississippi, Jefferson Davis began his military career as a second lieutenant. His commission was signed by his childhood hero, President Andrew Jackson.
Very few really stayed in the Army in the 1820s and 30s. The Army was not a wonderful path to career advancement.
For Davis, as for so many out of the Frontier Army, it was a case of going from one post to another, all of them very much alike.
Today I'm 22 years old, and when I was a boy and dreamed with my eyes open, as most do, I thought of ripening fame at this age, of wealth and power. But as I grew older, I saw the folly of this, but still thought, at the age of 22, I should be on the highway to all ambition desired. And lo, I am 22, and the same obscure poor being that I was at 15.
Jefferson Davis, Fort Winnebago, June 3, 1829.
And in the letter, he mentions the possibility of going to law school, that he's ordered law books. Here again, we think he was probably emulating Joseph Davis, his brother, who was a lawyer. And being a lawyer was a profession that was looked up to in Mississippi. It was also a road to politics.
Jefferson Davis often took time on his many furloughs home to Mississippi to seek counsel from Brother Joseph on what to do with his life. Joseph Davis continually encouraged his younger brother to stay in the military. At the same time, restless Americans moved confidently westward, often sparking conflict on native lands. And in 1832, when Jefferson Davis returned to Fort Crawford, he saw the end of the Black Hawk War.
Jefferson Davis will miss most of what is called the Black Hawk War. That is, he'll miss active engagement in any of its battles. But he'll be present when Black Hawk himself, the great warrior, is forced to surrender.
Black Hawk was taken to Fort Crawford, where Colonel Zachary Taylor assigned Jefferson Davis to be the escort guard, taking the chief to St. Louis.
Black Hawk, of course, was to be sent east in chains. Davis got the chains taken off of him, because he knew how they would humiliate a proud man like an Indian chief. Davis understood how this proud man, once leader of his people, must have felt in this situation of abject humiliation. What Davis, of course, could not know is that 30 years later he would be in exactly the same spot himself.
While Jefferson Davis was at Fort Crawford, he fell in love with Sarah Knox Taylor, daughter of his commanding officer, Colonel Zachary Taylor. The feeling was mutual, and the two spoke of marriage. While Jefferson Davis and Colonel Taylor got along well at first, a rift occurred when Davis voted against him during the court-martial of a fellow officer. After that, Taylor would not give Sarah and Jefferson his blessing.
Dreams, my dear Sarah, are our weakest thoughts, and yet by dreams I have been lately almost crazed, for they were of you, and the sleeping imagination painted you not such as I left you, not such as I could like to see you. Sarah, whatever I may be hereafter, I will ascribe to you. Neglected by you, I should be worse than nothing. And if the few good qualities I possess shall, under your smiles, yield a fruit, it will be yours.
Jefferson Davis, Fort Gibson, Oklahoma Territory, December 16, 1834.
Knox was every bit as strong-headed as Jefferson Davis and kept pushing them for permission. Davis even resigned from the Army because the stated reason why Colonel and Mrs. Taylor would not permit the marriage was because they did not want their daughter marrying a military officer.
The Taylors didn't want their daughters to go through what the daughter's mother had. So naturally, every Taylor daughter wound up marrying an Army officer.
In May 1835, Jefferson Davis resigned his commission in the United States Army, and after 2 years, the Taylors finally consented to the marriage. Sarah and Jefferson wed the following month.
Probably no man was ever happier than Jefferson Davis when he finally got permission to marry Sarah Taylor. He persuaded her very early to come on to his plantation because I think he simply could not wait to be home in the new plantation his brother Joseph was setting him up with. He couldn't wait to have Sarah, now Davis, there with him to begin their lives, to begin families, to start the next chapter in the lives they were to have together. And he persuaded her, in fact, that it was perfectly healthy to do so, even though this was the summer.
It was known as the sick season, where people believed that the low-lying areas around the southern Mississippi River bred disease, most notably malaria.
The Davis plantations lay right along the Mississippi River. In terms of feet above sea level, you're talking in the double digits. It's very low ground. It's swampy in those places that haven't been cleared. And Jefferson was concerned that he and his new bride moved to safer ground.
So Jefferson took Sarah in August of 1835 to his sister's plantation in Louisiana, Locust Grove. But by then, it was too late.
Both of them were struck down, however. Both were struck by a virulent form of malaria.
She got much sicker, much faster. And as they settled in to go through their illness and they hoped convalescence at Locust Grove, perhaps because of her smaller constitution, Sarah much more quickly succumbed.
Sarah and Jefferson shared few memories from only 3 months of marriage, but their love of music, especially the song Fairy Bells, haunted Locust Grove.
I dreamt 'twas but a dream that were my bride, love. I dreamt.
She dies in a delirium even while her husband Jefferson is in another room in the same house, himself almost delirious from the disease and hallucinating that he can hear her singing.
While fairy bells came tinkling o'er the water, merrily, merrily, merrily it fell. Merrily, merrily, merrily it fell, the echo of that fairy bell.
Jefferson himself escaped death, but he almost died, and he was severely ill for a number of months after that, and the ravages of this malarial attack were with him until he did die 54 years later.
Jefferson Davis was shattered by his young wife Knox's death. He goes into a period of grieving that will last almost a decade.
He reeled emotionally and literally. I think for the rest of his life, he utterly cherished the memory of Sarah Knox.
He will never be the same man again. The joyous, fun-loving, impish, sometimes miscreantish young man he'd been at West Point and even in the Army disappears with Sarah Taylor's death, to be replaced by the more cool, the aloof, the Jefferson Davis that people would come to know when he went into his public life.
But before life after Sarah could begin, Jefferson Davis had to recover. The malaria that took his young bride had come very close to taking his life as well.
He was going to start farming up there. Davis been with his brother Joseph, but he was still very weak. He was still basically a sick man in the fall of 1835.
Evidence of just how deeply the loss of Sarah hurt Davis, and I think as well evidence of just how much he felt his own agency in her death, is the fact that for the first 2 years after Sarah's passing, Jefferson Davis became almost a total recluse. It took him nearly a decade to cope with Sarah's loss, and in the end it was largely through the aid of his brother Joseph, who provided a plantation for Jefferson, who provided the money he needed, who provided him his first slaves. It's Joseph who begins to force Jefferson Davis out of the walls that he's built around himself to deal with his grief.
For reasons not altogether clear, Joseph never titled Briarfield in his brother's name. So in 1835, Jefferson Davis was a widower with no career, and who truly owned just one thing, the inherited slave James Pemberton, who had been Davis's constant companion since the frontier posts.
He returned with Davis and was at first the only person helping him clear this new plantation, the land that his brother Joseph had given him. And the two of them worked, and they built a house, and they cleared the land and started it. Not only gradually did Davis acquire some additional slaves.
Over the years, James Pemberton would become Davis's most trusted plantation manager or overseer, especially as Jefferson began studying in the vast library his brother had amassed at Hurricane Plantation and was looking beyond Davis Bend and his own broken heart.
Joseph teaches him how to be a planter, a slave owner, how to be a Southern gentleman, and the issues on which Southern gentlemen were basing their heritage and their society.
But in 1838, Jefferson Davis yet again seemed to question his life path. Whether it was the ghost of Sarah Knox Taylor or the ghosts of his own insecurities that motivated him, Davis took a trip to Washington, D.C., seeking a commission in the expanding United States Army.
This is the same Jefferson Davis who was so tired of the military, even when he was at West Point, that he thought about leaving. This is the same Jefferson Davis who, doing frontier duty, thought the military had ruined him for any other occupation, but then he would turn around and think about, maybe I should go into railroading, or maybe I should go home and be a planter. He always wants to be somewhere, he always wants to do something, but it's often not what he's doing or where he is at the moment.
Politics, I am out of my element, and naturally slip back to seeding and plowing the canebrake in which I live. I am as retired as a man on the great thoroughfare of the Mississippi can be.
Jefferson Davis, letters written from Briarfield, late 1830s. For the next 5 years, he did not stray very far from Davis Bend, resolving to be a Southern planter. But the political bug had bitten Davis, however gently at first, during his visit to Washington. True to character, brother Joseph did everything to encourage him. In August 1840, Jefferson Davis arrived at the Warren County Courthouse in Vicksburg, where he was named a delegate to the Mississippi Democratic State Convention.
And Davis would be, from that moment on, he would be in Mississippi politics. He moved along very quickly in Mississippi politics. His first attempt at office, he ran for the legislature from Warren County. He lost. Warren County was a Whig county, and in fact, the regular Democratic candidate dropped out of the race only a couple weeks before the election. It was his first try for elective office, and he didn't make it. This endeared him to his Democratic fellows because he was willing to pick up the torch when it was down, to go out and fight the good fight, even though he didn't win.
Despite his defeat, Davis did not quit, and in 1844 he was named a Democratic elector for the state of Mississippi.
Davis went out and he went all across Mississippi campaigning for the Democratic ticket for James K. Polk, and when James K. Polk was elected, president and he carried Mississippi, again, that helped Jefferson Davis. He was now becoming a known quantity in Mississippi apart from Warren County.
Politics was not the only area where Joseph took an interest in Jefferson's life. Joseph took it upon himself to invite down to Davis Bend the spirited young Verena Banks Howell, daughter of Joseph's close friend in Natchez.
For the first time, at least as far as the record shows, he really has an interest in a woman for the first time since Sarah Knox's death. Sarah Knox died in 1835. We're now talking about the beginnings of 1844. So we've gone through 8 years, and he has really smitten this young woman.
We do know that she had somewhat ambivalent feelings about him. She wrote a letter shortly after meeting him in which she said she thought he might be an older man, but then he might be a young man. He seemed to be both. He seemed pleasant and affable, yet on the other hand he seemed proud and aloof. She was not sure she liked him.
When she leaves to go back to Natchez, the letters he writes her, this is a fellow who is just head over heels in love. He talks about he can't bear to be from her sight. He can't bear for the mail to come on the steamboat and not get anything from her. He's all concerned about her.
My own dearest Verena, I doubt not of any man who, having an opportunity to know you, would not love you. In addition to the desire I have to be with you every day and all day, it seems to me but proper and necessary that I should announce to your parents my wish to marry you.
Jefferson Davis, Hurricane Plantation, March 8th, 1844.
But history seems to be repeating itself because there's this vast age difference. And Verena Davis's mother is concerned about this age difference. She's also concerned because she knew how important Sarah Knox was to Jefferson and how devastating Sarah Knox's death was to Jefferson. She knew that because of Joseph's relationship with her husband, William Howell.
On February 26, 1845, Jefferson and Verena were married at her parents' Natchez, Mississippi home called the Briars.
Jefferson Davis was 26 when he married the first time to Sarah Knox Taylor. He was 37 when he married Verena. There's a big difference between being in your mid-20s and in your mid-30s, especially if by your mid-30s you have already lost a wife, you have lost several of your siblings, your parents. By the 1840s, he knew a lot of tragedy in his personal life. He knew that things did not always go as you planned.
The newlyweds returned to Mississippi, to Davis Bend, and Jefferson resumed his life as a Southern planter.
To be a planter in the 19th century was more than to sit on a veranda and sip mint juleps. Sometimes the picture that we place in our mind sees a person who does very little except to enjoy life. In actuality, the planter leader had tremendous responsibilities and tremendous obligations. First of all, they had to run a business. They were agrarian capitalists, really. They weren't farmers. They like to talk about themselves as farmers in the land, but they were capitalists providing a crop, a product, and looking into the world market to sell it.
With a social structure similar to the class system in England, the Southern planter lorded over the land and a race of people who looked to him as master.
Davis believed that in the South, Southern society could not survive without slavery because he believed, as did most white Southerners, in fact most white Northerners and white Europeans at the time as well, that blacks were inferior to whites. And when you had large numbers of blacks, the superior race had to control the inferior race. The method of control was slavery.
Jefferson Davis, like every other American in the 19th century, with very few exceptions, was a racist. In that, I mean that Americans in the 19th century, be they an Abraham Lincoln or be they a Jefferson Davis, believed that the Caucasian race had an obligation as what they called the superior race to take care of less fortunate people.
There were some masters who truly believed that slavery was a good thing, that we are introducing you into a higher civilized society, and so they weren't burdened down with the guilt. I mean, they felt that they were really doing you a favor by introducing you through this form of apprenticeship.
Davis believed that slavery was good for blacks because he said it was the great Christianizing and civilizing mission for white Southerners to bring heathen Africans to the United States, Christianize them and civilize them. In 1860, when the slave regime ended, he had 103 slaves, so he went from 1 to 103. There was natural increase on his slave plantations. I mean, men and women had children. He kept buying slaves throughout the 1840s and 50s. There is no evidence that he sold slaves.
Beyond the numbers, modern scholarship is divided over the day-to-day specifics of slave life on the Davis brothers' plantations, but most scholars agree on the generalities of slave life on Davis Bend.
He had grown up with slavery. Slavery was a fact of life for him. Slavery was provided for in the Constitution. Slavery was an American institution, not just a Southern one. Northerners owned slaves too, he knew that. I think he saw slavery as a beneficent institution, mainly from watching what went on around him as far as the treatment of slaves. His brother Joseph was known as a particularly tolerant and easy slave owner, gave his slaves a lot of freedoms. And because of their isolated location, Davis didn't have the opportunity to observe other slave owners who might have been more harsh and doctrinaire.
The disagreement, however, surrounds the lack of written records from the 1830s through 1865 versus the family's oral tradition that's based on written accounts from nearly half a century after the fact. A letter from Joseph's granddaughter, written in the late 1880s, and Verena's own memoir, written in 1890. Both accounts depict a utopian portrait of slave life on Davis Bend.
And the two Davis brothers were, if anything, very atypical slaveholders. For a start, they didn't believe in cruelty. Jefferson Davis would always have difficulty keeping an overseer because they would be too rough on the slaves. He loathed the idea of cruelty to a child, and he loathed the idea of cruelty to a slave, as he always seemed to equate the two. Slaves were like children in Davis's mind. When one of the Davis slaves was accused of misbehaving, he allowed the slaves to compose a jury and a court of their own, and they tried each other. They were tried by their peers, in fact. And he found, incidentally, that the slaves tended to be much more harsh in the punishments they dealt out to one of their own than Davis was likely to be.
I don't get any feeling that there's a general schooling, but there certainly was not. There was no discouragement. I mean, you sometimes hear that the slaves were discouraged from becoming literate. That was certainly not the case with the Davises. They had too much respect for learning and literacy, and quite different from some plantation systems. There is no evidence whatsoever that there was any misconduct toward the female slaves. As I said, there's nobody walking down the back path at Briarfield or Hurricane. There was a respect for the family and the children and the unity.
In the context of the time, and it's important to remember this is in the context of that time, these were enormously enlightened and benign views on slaves and on slavery itself. There's no question that Davis believed that slavery was the proper station for blacks in American society. He didn't think they were sufficiently intelligent or mature or responsible enough to function on their own.
The whole truth, though, will never be known, because during the war between the states, the books and records at Hurricane Plantation were burned, and the records at Briarfield were plundered and scattered by Union troops. What remains are fragments and anecdotes, like those of the slaves who contacted Davis after the war.
One of his former slaves, who was living somewhere in the north, I think, heard that he had been released from prison and was very poor and was looking for, a job or something. And he said, well, Mr. Davis was always very kind to me, and if $1,000 would be of any help to him, I would be glad to advance it. Now that's a fair statement of confidence in your former master.
One surviving specific element that Davis scholars agree on is the historical record detailing the relationship Davis had with his first slave, James Pemberton.
He and James Pemberton would sit and talk over the plantation affairs. Davis would always invite him to sit down, and they would chat. And when the session was over, he would give James Pemberton a cigar. So I guess James Pemberton liked cigars too. It's a very interesting relationship that they could be so close.
It was crucial that Davis have a trusted overseer, because for the next 20 years, Davis would not stay at Briarfield on a regular basis. Politics was calling, and Washington and the campaign trail would be his primary home. Jefferson Davis could no longer hide from the world. He couldn't remain a reclusive planter, burying himself in books at night. Issues like slavery, the annexation of Texas, and the incendiary issue of tariffs all conspired to draw him away from his plantation and thrust him squarely into politics. So, in 1845, Jefferson Davis ran for the United States House of Representatives.
He had covered the state as a presidential elector, but he was elected to Congress in 45, and he went to Washington to take his seat in December of 45. So 1845 is a notable year. He begins a political career, and he begins a second marriage.
But like most of Jefferson Davis's years, 1845 was bittersweet. In the face of new and great accomplishments, he lost his beloved mother, Jane Cook Davis.
He left the campaign trail. He went down to Woodville to her funeral. She is buried at Rosemont, the Davis family home there. But politics called, and he left the funeral and went back to campaign.
Jefferson Davis was elected to the House of Representatives in November 1845, and in December made the journey east to take office for what for him was going to be a very brief tenure indeed. Freshman congressmen then, as now, were expected to be seen and not heard, to learn the ropes, to learn where everything was, to learn who the committee chair people were, to learn the ways of the House of Representatives. But that was not Davis's way. He stood up to make his first speech on the floor of the House 10 days after he'd taken office. This was virtually unheard of.
To all which has been said of the inherent powers of this government, I answer, it is the creature of the states. As such, it could have no inherent power. All it possesses was delegated by the states, and it is therefore that our Constitution is not an instrument of limitations, but of grants.
Jefferson Davis, House Floor, 1846. Jefferson Davis's participation and speeches caught the attention of fellow Congressman and former President John Quincy Adams. In addition to his sectional and states' rights platform, Jefferson Davis championed several national causes. One in particular has had lasting social impact: the Smithsonian Institution.
Davis was very interested in progress of all kinds of material progress. He was interested in technology. He was interested in science. And the Smithsonian Institution was really the first national institution in this country that had a mission of trying to do something about advancing technology.
Perhaps echoing in part his own educational fortune, Jefferson Davis enthusiastically supported such an establishment, calling knowledge the common cement that could unite the Union into one mass. Congress, though, was divided on whether the national institution should exist, but Davis's passionate speeches and foresight saw the measure pass, and President Polk signed into law on August 10, 1846, the bill that created the Smithsonian Institution.
We don't know how his whole first term as a congressman would have played out, because the war with Mexico came along to put an end to it.
Tensions between Mexico and the United States inflamed over the U.S. annexation of Texas, and the situation very quickly evolved into a border dispute.
President Polk orders General Taylor to march to the Rio Grande to assert American sovereignty. On the banks of the Rio Grande, the inevitable happens. Taylor's men and Mexican soldiers come in contact with each other, and they're shooting. And the shooting occurs on the northern bank of the Rio Grande. And James K. Polk says that American soldiers are shot at on American territory, therefore we must go to war. And he asks Congress for a declaration of war against Mexico, which he gets.
I have the honor to acknowledge and accept the commission of Colonel in the 1st Regiment of Mississippi Volunteers. For this most gratifying mark of confidence, I return my sincerest thanks.
Jefferson Davis, Washington, D.C., June 20th, 1846.
Varina Davis was not at all happy that her husband, Jefferson Davis, wanted to go off, become a colonel of the Mississippi Volunteers, and go off to war with Mexico. There'll be hints then and later that Davis will have difficulty making up his mind, difficulty completely committing himself to something. He always wants to be somewhere, he always wants to do something, but it's often not what he's doing or where he is at the moment. And his desire to go into the military in 1846 is part of that. But to his young wife, to whom he has been married only months, the idea of her husband leaving her, going to an unknown climate, to an unknown fate, was terrible indeed. And she appears to have actively tried to persuade him not to do so. But in the end, as so often in their marriage, he would make the decision and she would simply decide to abide by it.
So on July 4th, 1846, Jefferson Davis left Washington, D.C., bound for Mexico with one final stop, Briarfield Plantation. He wanted to tie up affairs in case he didn't return.
Jefferson Davis was almost 20 years older than Varina Howell, and I think he did take on the tone of a parent. And Varina was very feisty, she was very opinionated, and I think he found that a little difficult in the early years of their marriage. He suddenly found himself faced with more of an equal than he had planned. He thought she was going to be, I think, a lot more pliant than she turned out to be. She definitely had her own opinions, and they obviously were voiced.
But before leaving the plantation, Jefferson Davis had a heartfelt, sincere discussion with his slave, James Pemberton.
Davis did offer to manumit him when Davis himself left for the Mexican War, and James Pemberton refused to be liberated. He preferred to stay on what had become his home and to take care of Varina Davis and the other slaves who were there on the place.
Dear Varina, after an extraordinarily quiet voyage, we are at anchor waiting for a lighter to get ashore on the Brazos Island. Again, I ask that the season of our absence may be a season of reflection. My love for you place my happiness in your keeping. Husband would kiss the paper he sends to wife, but is in the midst of the men who, though talking and whistling and wondering when the lighter will come, have time enough to observe anything the Colonel does. I send a kiss upon the wires of love and feel air, earth, and sea cannot break the connection.
Jefferson Davis, July 29th, 1846.
Davis showed remarkable energy in building his regiment of Mississippi Volunteers. He had a number of things to drive him in this. For one, of course, he had a West Point education, so he thought he understood the military. He thought he understood frontier service, and indeed he had seen several years of it. He also, of course, had the benefit this time not of being an obscure second lieutenant or first lieutenant. Now he was to be colonel of the Mississippi Volunteers. He would have command of his own regiment in a position with a rank of real prestige. Being a colonel was going to open doors for Davis anywhere in the South, indeed at that time, anywhere in the Union.
With his Mississippi Rifles in fighting form, Davis marched his men, along with a column of 15,000 troops, down into Mexico. They first met the enemy outside the city of Monterey.
It was Jefferson Davis's baptism under fire, and Davis did very well as a regimental commander in the Battle of Monterey, both in the taking of a Mexican fort on the outskirts of the city and in the fighting down in the interior of the city and the street fighting as they approached the main square in the city.
Davis's prowess as a field commander did not go unnoticed, especially by his former father-in-law and once again commanding officer, General Zachary Taylor.
Whatever hard feelings had been felt were put away, and the two men embraced each other. And they formed a friendship, or recreated a friendship, I probably should say refashioned a friendship is probably the best word to say.
But like so much of Jefferson Davis's life, just as one thing was going well, another was in turmoil. Davis asked for leave to return to Mississippi.
Allegedly, he asked for leave to come home to check on health and so forth, but the reason he came home was because his wife, Marina, and his eldest brother, Joseph, were literally at war with one another. That he felt he had to come back to see if he couldn't pacify the two people who meant most to him.
Davis traveled for 2 weeks and almost 1,000 miles to mediate between his beloved wife and brother. Upon reaching Mississippi, he laid down the law and expected total compliance from his wife. By December 1846, he was back on board a ship bound for Mexico. During his absence, the war was going well for the Americans, and they saw victories on all fronts. Davis returned to Taylor's army in the Mexican interior just as the Mexicans were launching an offensive.
Zachary Taylor takes his army down there to confront this Mexican advance, and in February of 1847, the two armies collide at a place called Buena Vista, which was the name of a Mexican hacienda. And in a bitter fight there, the 1st Mississippi Regiment has a really cardinal role to play in terms of foiling attempts by the Mexican army to turn the American left flank.
And it was the Mississippi Rifles who held the left flank. That was a very touch-and-go battle, and his men managed to hold the position for the United States Army.
And he had this infantry regiment with him, his own infantry regiment, and some reinforcements behind him. And when he saw these people coming, he thought the only thing he could do was to put his units in a V and have them fire toward the center.
The V formation was actually an upside-down V formation. It meant that he met the enemy with the center of his regiment pulled back from the two exposed flanks. And in so doing, he invited, if you would, the enemy into the area where his men could more effectively fire upon the Mexican troops. During the battle, he suffered a wound. What happened was a bullet shattered a brass spur, and it drove shards from that spur into his foot. Pieces of brass would work its way out of Davis's foot, and he would be in constant pain. It was something that would trouble him for much of the rest of his life.
After Buena Vista, the Mississippi Rifles became part of an army of occupation. They saw little further action in the field. They entered Mexico with 900 troops. Only 376 would return to Mississippi.
Davis came back from Mexico a bona fide hero. He came back with everything a young man of his time and place could hope to have. A high rank as a colonel, an important role and a significant victory behind him, and a wound. He had bled for his country. The Mexican War did not produce that many heroes, but one of them was Jefferson Davis, and it would be the foundation of his political career to come. No sooner did he get home than Jesse Speight, a sitting senator from Mississippi, died, and the governor had it in his power to appoint a successor for the balance of Speight's term, and that appointment went to Jefferson Davis.
But it wasn't an easy decision for Jefferson Davis because President Polk had a brigadier generalship to award, and he was pressured to award the new commission to Davis.
Well, if there's one thing better than being a colonel, it's being a general. And yet this is Davis, who so often did not want to be in the military, yet wanted to get back into it. Now he has the chance of staying in the military with an enhanced position, or leaving that and going into an enhanced position in politics.
Jefferson Davis wrote personally to President Polk and declined the appointment of brigadier general. He gave as his primary reason the firm belief that troops should only fall under state, not federal command, a position he'd have to reverse as Confederate president. So Jefferson Davis accepted Mississippi Governor Albert G. Brown's appointment to fill the vacant seat in the United States Senate.
Jefferson Davis entered the Senate on December 6, 1847. And if I had to pick a date throughout the whole 2-century plus history of the Senate, to be a senator, that would be at the very top of my list. The Senate had really come into its own by the late 1840s. And you could tell that by the people who were members of the Senate. There was Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, Sam Houston of Texas. A senator could stand up in that wonderfully intimate small Senate chamber, the one that's called the Old Senate Chamber today. And it was, if anything, it was a theater. What you'd see on that floor was memorable.
On the way to Washington, D.C. in November of 1847, Jefferson Davis suffered a month-long recurrence of malaria combined with his lingering war wound. And after hobbling up on crutches to take his oath of office, his first order of business was to get himself elected in his own right.
There were opponents, but Davis, he was such a hero that nobody had a chance. Mississippi was a Democratic state. Davis was a hero. He really didn't have much trouble getting elected in his own right in 1848.
The paramount issue facing all politicians of the day, though, was how to deal with slavery in the United States territories. The land ceded to the United States from the Mexican War continued the national expansion west and further divided the country politically between the North and the South.
This comes to the whole idea of states' rights. Where does the ultimate power lie? Does it reside with the people of the states separately considered, or does it rely with the people of the United States collectively considered? And there are arguments on both sides. So as the United States begins to expand, as it receives all this land from the Mexican War, the question comes, can slavery expand into the new territory?
Southerners claim that they should have every right to take their slaves to the territories. They say they are American citizens, and the territories belong to American citizens. And all American citizens have the right to go to the territories and take their property. The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution says that property can't be taken without due process. We think of the Fifth Amendment in terms of not to incriminate yourself, but it's also a due process clause. And they said, so Congress can't just pass a law and say you can't take slaves to the territories.
Publicly, the debate circled the morality and ethics of slavery. But for Southern senators, the debate also hinged on political power.
Shall a discrimination against one section, the palpable object of which is to totally destroy political equality, be sanctioned by the common agent of the states and hasten its progress to the inevitable goal of such a principle, the disunion of the states?
Jefferson Davis, Senate floor, July 12, 1848.
Southerners believed that they were American. They believed that they were moral. They believed that they were loyal. They believed they were patriotic, just like Jefferson Davis. And to be told that no, you're not, that you're not moral, that you're not patriotic, that you're not American, was a slap in their face.
Davis and the other Southern leaders were concerned that if the federal government decided the issue against slavery in the territories, then it was just a matter of time before it encroached on the rest of an individual state's sovereign rights.
It was the dispute over the extension of slavery that was linked in very closely to the balance of political power between the northern states and the southern states. The North feared that the extension of slavery would tip the balance even more in the favor of the South, and so that they could get their way with federal legislation. For every 5 slaves, there were counted as 3 people for purposes of determining how many members of Congress there would be in each state. And so if slavery were to go into the new territories, that would have artificially inflated the congressional representation of the Democratic Party, which was the Southern, mostly in the South.
They feared the plantation system, which is like Walmart's coming into your small town. Now, a large plantation coming into perhaps the West or something might make it impossible for the small farmers to survive. So there were other issues. The South, on the other hand, said slavery is not something that is illegal or unconstitutional. Therefore, the national government has an obligation to protect slavery wherever slave owners want to go.
The first area of compromise, later known as the Compromise of 1850, was whether or not to allow slavery in the territories won in the Mexican War. Jefferson Davis was a great believer in the democratic process. Though he opposed many facets of the Compromise of 1850, he always felt that the battle should be waged with argument on the Senate floor, not with rifles on the battlefield.
We of the South stand now as we always have stood, upon the defensive. We raise not this question, but when raised, it is our duty to defend ourselves. We, sir, are parties to this union only under the Constitution, and there is no power known in the world that could dictate to my little state a union in which her rights were continually disrespected and trampled upon by an unrestrained majority.
Jefferson Davis, Senate floor, January 10th, 1850. The governor's race in Mississippi called Jefferson Davis and his allegiance to his beloved state home.
The incumbent governor in Mississippi was John A. Quitman, who had been a major figure in Mississippi politics for a generation. In fact, he'd become a major general in the Army during the Mexican War and was Jefferson Davis's immediate commander at the Battle of Monterey.
Early in 1850, Quitman withdrew from the race, and Whig candidate Henry Stewart Foote became the frontrunner. And with very little time left, the States' Rights Party drafted Davis as their candidate.
And he pulled within fewer than 1,000 votes of Foote, but he lost. What's even more amazing about that, when he agreed to run with this thing, he resigned from the Senate. So he no longer had his United States Senate, so he didn't want to hold that while he was running for governor. On top of that, he had just passed through an excruciatingly painful illness, but he got up from this sick bed to make this run for the State Rights Party.
No longer in politics, Davis returned to Briarfield for his longest period of time as a Southern planter, 18 months.
But 1852 comes very quickly, and 1852 is a presidential year.
And the newly constituted Democratic Party regained control of the executive office with the election of Franklin Pierce.
Interestingly enough, Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire ended up bringing Jefferson Davis back into national politics.
Franklin Pierce and Jefferson Davis had similar political views. They had met in Mexico. Pierce knew him as a senator, and he also knew he had military experience. He was the perfect man for Secretary of War. As Secretary of War, he showed a great deal of competence in handling the office. Perhaps the one he's best known for was the so-called Camel Corps. With the Mexican War, we brought in a tremendous amount of territory, and much of it was desert. The camels did work, though, and that's what people forget. The camels worked. They were an asset to the army in the desert. But with the coming of the railroad, the coming of the Civil War, they were forgotten. Many of them were sold to circuses, and supposedly a few simply ran wild in the desert.
Davis continued his innovative plans as he targeted other parts of the United States military, including increasing the size and pay of the Army, providing for widows and orphans, and building homes for wounded soldiers, revamping the curriculum at West Point, and had routes surveyed to the Pacific Ocean for the Transcontinental Railroad. He also modernized weapons and battlefield techniques. These advancements, though, would all come back to haunt him when he faced that very same strengthened army as President of the Confederacy in less than a decade.
Jefferson Davis was one of the two best secretaries of war. John C. Calhoun and Jefferson Davis, interestingly, both Southerners, both senators, were two outstanding secretaries of war. I think Jefferson Davis's contribution was he was not looking for political benefits. When Jefferson Davis went in to do a job, he went in to do it professionally.
But Davis's least known and yet most enduring accomplishment was overseeing the expansion of the United States Capitol building.
I would argue that Jefferson Davis, more than any other single person, is responsible for the way the Capitol building looks today. And not only the outside with its great cast iron dome and the Statue of Freedom, on top of it and the big bronze doors. He was responsible for the design of that statue and for the design of those doors. But from my point of view, even more important, once you go into the building, you start from the center and you see a fairly severe building and not a lot of color in the older portions. But once you move into what we still call the new portions of the Capitol, the parts that were opened in the late 1850s, you see rich gold leaf. You see bright colors in frescoed works of art. That was all Jefferson Davis's doing. He had a strong commitment to making the building beautiful, making it attractive, and making it sort of a national gallery of art.
He is considered to be the father of the Capitol extension because he wrote the legislation. Davis's legacy is a very important contribution as a key player who transformed a small, rather idiosyncratic building that had been begun by George Washington in 1793, had been nurtured through the Jefferson administration and burned by the British in the War of 1812, and finally drawn to a conclusion at the beginning of the Jackson administration. And what we have, thankfully and gratefully, is a building that has been transformed into the magnificent structure that commands the world's respect. A building that has been admired for its grace and its beauty, is a symbol of national pride today.
But for all of Davis's accomplishments as Secretary of War, there was yet again terrible personal tragedy.
Samuel Davis, Jefferson Varina's first child, born in 1852, died in the summer of 1854. Davis rejoiced in this little man. After all, Davis in 1854 was a person who was 46 years old. This was his first child. He was joyous with him. He talked about him. His wife would say he would come home from the office of the War Department to play with him. And when Samuel got sick, probably with some childhood disease, we can't know for sure exactly what he had, and he died pretty quickly. Davis, of course, his father, was devastated. This was the first, and they waited so long for him.
Varina recalls hearing him pacing the room all night long. He couldn't rest, he couldn't sleep. He was so in such grief over this. She, of course, was grieving too, but handled it and more easily than he did. He simply was inconsolable about the loss.
Though Varina had a difficult time carrying a pregnancy up to Samuel's birth, thereafter other children came in quick succession, and she had two more before 1860 and another one in 1861. So children came very quickly thereafter, and the Davis household was not without the patter of small feet for very long.
On the morning of March 4th, 1857, Jefferson Davis resigned from his successful tenure as Secretary of War. At noon, the very same day, he was sworn in as a senator from the state of Mississippi. 2 days after his swearing in, the United States Supreme Court decided on the Dred Scott case, sanctioning the Southern view of slavery in the territories. Davis fully supported the new Democratic president, James Buchanan, seeing in him a strong proponent of states' rights. Even though the sectional cauldron continued to boil, Davis still felt that the South's future lay within the Union. For Davis, there was renewed hope that his beloved Union of states would continue unabated and undivided.
When Davis re-enters the Senate, after he leaves office as Secretary of War, he's now one of the leading spokesmen for the Southern position in Washington. As a result, Davis returns to the Senate with a voice that, before it's first heard, is already more powerful and more influential than that of most other Southern leaders of the time.
It's a tense, uptight Senate. The optimism is gone, and it's just a long, difficult march toward disaster at a time when Jefferson Davis himself must have been feeling terribly physically.
Davis suffered his worst bout with neuralgia, the disease affecting his left eye. It left him in excruciating pain and nearly incapacitated. But by 1858, with his health failing and less than 2 years into his second Senate term, hope, even for optimist Davis, was beginning to wane. In spite of debilitating illness, he continued to work on the Capitol expansion as senator. He wanted to create a great temple to democracy, a veritable art gallery, putting the United States on the world stage. But what was happening inside those renovated doors was far from Davis's ideal, and the renovation, for all its beauty, could not conceal the turmoil inside its walls.
These were not the arguments which our fathers made when, through the struggles of the Revolutionary War, they laid the foundation of this Union. These are not the principles on which our Constitution, a bundle of compromises, was made. Then, the navigating and agricultural states did not war to see which could most injure the other, but each conceded something from that which it believed to be its own interest, to promote the welfare of the other. Those debates, whilst they brought up all the struggles which belonged to the opposite interests and opposite localities, showed none of the bitterness which so unfortunately characterizes every debate in which this body is involved.
Jefferson Davis, Senate floor, February 1858.
Well, as Davis begins to get well, his physicians recommend he take a trip to New England. He does go up to New England. He spends a good bit of time in Maine, and he's rejuvenated. He had an enormously successful visit in Maine. He made a number of public speeches. He had there was a positive public reaction to him, and Davis began to believe that what he had first thought in the Pierce administration was really true, that there were enough Northerners who were willing to give the Southerners what the Southerners saw as their rights, that the country could go on along, that things weren't going to come to an end.
Democrats, patriots, by whatever political name any of you may be known, you have a sacred duty to perform to your ancestry and to posterity. The time is at hand for good or for evil. The questions which have agitated the public mind are to be solved.
Jefferson Davis, Portland, Maine, September 11th, 1858.
Ironically, he got in trouble when he was in Maine, political trouble, but not from Republicans, not from Northerners, from sectional radicals in the South, who thought that Davis's comments in the North were too mild. Davis had said things like the Union should survive. Davis had said things like people should not carelessly talk about throwing away the Union. And these radical Southerners got very upset about this. And in fact, Davis's political colleagues in Mississippi, some of them recognized Davis's trouble, and they told him right away, you've got to cover yourself on this.
And as Davis turned his focus to put out the political fires in the South, William Henry Seward and the growing Republican Party were developing a strategy to win its first national election.
And the Republican Party was a new thing in American history. It was a sectional party. The Republican Party made no effort in the slave states, no effort in the South. It wrote off the South. It said, we can win a national election by taking all the free states. There are enough electoral votes. If we can get them all, we can win. So they run on a very powerful anti-South platform. And the Republicans, this is their message, and they made a very astute move in their convention. While the Democrats were coming apart, the Republicans turned against the odds-on favorite, who was a man by the name of William Henry Seward. So they picked a man who was perceived as much more moderate than Seward, a man who they thought could carry that Southern tier across what we call the Midwest now. They picked Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln, of course, did carry every single free state except New Jersey. But other than that, Lincoln carried every single free state. He carried no slave states, and he won a national election. He only had 40% of the popular vote, however. Only 40%.
During the 1860 election, the Democratic Party turned on itself and sharply divided. Before the convention held in South Carolina in April of 1860 finally broke apart, it unanimously adopted a resolution that if a Republican were named president, it would be deemed a declaration of hostility. Yet in the face of Lincoln's election and howls of Southern secession, Davis did not give up on the Union, and he tried anything and everything to keep it together.
Jefferson Davis had been a member of the Senate Committee of 13. that met in the latter weeks of 1860 to try to forge a compromise. When that so-called Crittenden Compromise fell apart, Jefferson Davis knew that it was just a matter of weeks before Mississippi would withdraw from the Union. And so he prepared two speeches. One he delivered on January 10th, 1861, to a packed Senate chamber, in which he gave sort of an extended explanation of his views and said, the time is coming when I'm going to have to leave.
Jefferson Davis never advocated immediate secession. Davis had always maintained that secession was constitutional, but Davis realized that he was in walking a political tightrope, because after Lincoln's election, the governor of Mississippi invited the state's congressional delegation to meet with him in Jackson. Davis found that he was the only one who was opposed to immediate secession. But he told them before he left that whatever they did, he would follow Mississippi's course.
He really delayed long after the secession vote was a sure thing. All the other congressmen and his fellow senator had already left for Mississippi. I don't know whether he was still hoping against hope that something would happen to change things, but he did linger in Washington longer.
He loved Washington. I mean, he loved his days in Capitol Hill. He loved being Secretary of War. He loved being a member of the original board of the Smithsonian Institution. I mean, the fondness that he had for this place is just unbelievable.
When he gave his farewell speech, it was a major event in Washington. The galleries were crowded long before the Senate convened. Everyone wanted to see him for what might be the last time, hear what he had to say. The speech was very emotional for everyone concerned, even his political enemies, because I think they respected him as a person of principle. They realized that he was saying what he said because he truly believed it.
Davis spoke last, and you could hear a pin drop. The time for nullification talk is over. Now it's time to leave.
I am sure I feel no hostility to you, senators from the North. I am sure there is not one of you, whatever sharp discussions there may have been between us, to whom I cannot now say in the presence of my God, I wish you well. And such, I am sure, is the feeling of the people whom I represent towards those whom you represent. I therefore feel that I express their desire when I say I hope and they hope for peaceful relations with you, though we must part. Mr. President and Senators, having made the announcement which the occasion seemed to me to require, it only remains to me to bid you a final adieu.
And at that point he turned and walked up the center aisle of the chamber and out the rear doors, and you could hear, as one observer put it, the silent, muffled weeping. People knew at that point that the fat was in the fire, that the nation had come to a major crossroads, and people for decades afterwards who were there, who witnessed that, talked about that as one of the most startling and memorable moments of that particular Civil War era.
Thank you.